Welcome to Reach, your platform to connect with other executive assistants and acquire game-changing knowledge and perspective. Reach is designed to inspire your workday, guide you through pivotal moments in your career, and transform you into the executive assistant you've always wanted to be. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Reach. This is your host, Jessica Van. I'm the founder and CEO of Maven Recruiting Group. Today, I am so excited to welcome Taylor DeLorenzo to Reach. Hi, Taylor.
Hello, how are you?
I'm so good. How are you?
You know, I'm living the dream. Today, as we were prepping, I've got you can't see it, but I've got a wide smile on my face, and I'm excited to be here.
Oh, I think we might not be able to see it, but we can definitely hear it.
I
can hear the grin. This is great. Well, you're nothing if not enthusiastic. That was definitely one of my greatest takeaways from meeting you the first time. So I'm really excited to have you on the program. It's going to be a great conversation. We'll be talking about how to really shore up your confidence in order to accelerate your executive assistant career, something that you have done incredibly effectively. So to give our listeners just a little bit of context on you and your career, Taylor is really the definition of an A-list performer and high achiever. She is an Ivy League graduate from Cornell. Her first EA role was supporting a founder. Talk about hitting it out of the gates. Her next role, she served as the right hand to the CEO of publicly traded Shake Shack. Who hasn't eaten there, right? And then you leaped over to Twitter, where you supported the CMO and head of people and were quickly promoted to act as chief of staff there, driving strategic operations for the CMO. And perhaps most notably, you were selected as the executive assistant to step up and support the then CEO of Twitter. And keep in mind that there were 60 other executive assistants on staff at Twitter. So that really says an incredible amount about your abilities and value and the confidence and value you were able to project into the relationship to be eligible for that. So today we're excited to hear your story in your own words and also hear your thoughts on how to really shore up confidence and how to really accelerate your career, your abilities. So for anybody who is intrigued and wanting to kind of ascend to the next level, I think this will be a really, really illuminating conversation. There's no denying your ascent into what many would consider the quote unquote red carpet of the EA world has really been nothing less than meteoric. And, you know, as I've had the pleasure of getting to know you a little bit and spending some time with you, it's really clear the confidence and the self-assurance that you project. So I'd love to understand for our listeners, you know, where does that confidence come from? And was there a defining moment in your life that helped shape your maturity and self-confidence?
First, I would just like this. I'm going to listen to that recording the last 2 minutes anytime I'm feeling bad. Thank you for that pump up. And my 25-year-old self is like rolling their eyes that someone would say these things about me. So thank you. I feel, I feel very blessed to have ended up in the positions I've ended up in and the opportunities that have presented themselves to me. And I think if I had to pick a specific time, specific moment where things shifted, I think it was when I accepted that I'm a career EA and I'm really good at this and I like this and this is a good career and it can be really, challenging and you can grow a ton and it's far more than, secretarial, which I think many EAs when we start this role, it feels like, oh, I'm just, doing calendaring stuff. And I think, as I hope many of the listeners know and feel, that like, no, our execs couldn't do half of what they do without us. And this role is so much more important than just that kind of Mad Men era assistant, vibe. And so I think that when I really decided, hey, this isn't a a stepping stone, which for some people it is, and that's totally fine. But when I realized, I love what I do and I want to do this for the rest of my career, and therefore, like, heck yeah, I'm an executive assistant, and I'm going to go do it to the best of my abilities and at the biggest places I can do it. I think that was a real shift for me in confidence, that it wasn't like, oh, I'm just here for a little, and oh, no, I'm going to go do something else after this. So I think that's kind of broad strokes one moment. But I think the other piece is, like, I've been doing this for a long time. They say it takes 10,000 hours to become an expert. I've been doing this for a whole lot longer than 10,000 hours. I've been an executive assistant for, the better part of a decade. And I think something that a previous mentor said to me years ago that I think of quite often is, whether you're supporting the CEO or, a sales director, the core of your job is the same. It's calendar, expenses, travel, it's greeting guests, it's ordering flowers for somebody, it's grabbing the occasional coffee. That the core is the same. And so I think if you kind of think about it like that, whether you're early in your career, sure, supporting a director, you're still honing the skills that one day when you want to support a CEO that you're going to need. So we've all scheduled thousands of meetings. I've booked hundreds of flights, all sent too many emails. And so I think if you think about it like that, I've been honing the skill set for a long time. And it really is the basics. And when you feel like, oh, shoot, I could, someone asks for calendar availability, everybody listening to this call is like, oh yeah, let's get some, that's kind of innate, and you can do those things naturally, and you just get better at them and fit quicker and whatever that might be. So I think that's definitely a big piece of it. And I will say, I know that I'm on the lucky end, that I've had some wonderful execs, truly amazing people who have looked out for my growth and been open to those conversations of, hey, what do you want to do next? Really encouraging. And I do want to acknowledge not everybody is as lucky as I have been to have those, mentors and bosses that really care. But that's a huge thing when your boss, is putting you on things and saying, no, you can go do it. When they have confidence in you, that really does a whole lot of good for your own confidence. So I would love to give a shout out to all my former bosses who have been a huge, piece of my current confidence.
Yeah. Well, and I want to bookmark that thought and return to it a little bit later in our conversation when we talk about kind of your perception among these executives coming from a highly credentialed Ivy League background. I'd like to revisit that and hear from you as to how much you think that has influenced the way that you're perceived and the way that others view your capabilities. But let's come back to that one, because I think
for sure.
Yeah, I think that you touched on something really, really important, which is that all of this stuff, all this goodness, it really starts from a place of you, first and foremost, accepting, I guess, recognizing, number one, who you are and accepting that, and not in a way of feeling like, oh, this is a compromise, or I've settled in some way, or, I guess this is what I'm doing with my life kind of thing, but actually embracing and accepting in a really powerful sense who you are, and owning that. And I think that's really, really important, because if people sense that you're sort of defeated about where you are in life, or this is just sort of, kind of where you ended up, versus seeing this as your true conviction, right? Like, that has a very big impact on how people view you and what you're capable of.
It's huge. And I think, and thank you for kind of letting us double click on this, because I think I remember specifically early on in my career, I was like, I didn't go to college to become an assistant. Like, and this like negative self-talk that really, was not helpful. And I think, then again, as I mentioned, I had some really wonderful bosses who didn't treat me as such and said, hey, jump in on this project, jump in on that project, that sort of stuff. And I realized, and again, hopefully that as listeners know, this role can be so crucial to an organization if that's the dynamic the exec is looking for. And like, that's awesome. And I think also what I realized and why I love what I do is, I was a 24-year-old sitting in on executive team meetings or sitting in on a board meeting. Like in no other world are any of my peers doing stuff like that. And so I really started to get like a heck yeah, this is sick, like, and I'm good at it. And like and I think when I really said, yeah, this is exactly like, this is a career. I'm not just stuck here. I didn't just stumble into this and like, and then laid down and took it, it's just like, so that's a really big piece is like, I think to your point of, accepting who you are, I accepted the things and understood the things that I'm good at. I like calendaring. Like I like color coding calendars and putting things in organize them. And there is something about having one person, kind of this, subservient dynamic that like, I actually love doing things for other people in my personal life. And so if I could get paid to do it, and that's something that really motivates me, that's the stuff that I started to realize, hey, that's cool. Not everybody likes what they do. And certainly the people who love what they do are very lucky. But, if you can really bring your personal skill sets into your job, and if these are things that tick for you, that you are hyper organized and think in calendar mode, like, heck yeah, do a job that lets you do that all day.
Exactly. And that's where I think it really starts with just being honest with yourself, just having that kind of open, honest dialogue with yourself and not allowing the judgment of whatever to invade that, right? So, you went to Cornell.
Absolutely.
Is this career what they're priming you for and grooming you for? Maybe not, right? But at the end of the day, who cares? Because you've found the career that speaks to what your personal talents and your personal fulfillment, your personal, currency is. And I think that's amazing, because so many people never find that, and they never figure out what they really enjoy doing. And maybe they figure out what they enjoy doing, but they don't know how to equate that or translate that to an actual financially viable,
yes.
Job, and let alone like a 6-figure plus kind of a job, right? Like EAs at this level do very well for themselves. So I think that that's a really important takeaway about that you've shared with everybody. And that would be my encouragement, is that start with yourself, start with your own reflection. And can you, are you at peace with who you are? Because if you're not, like, you got to figure that one out first and foremost.
This is, first of all, how much time we got? Because I have a lot of thoughts on that. But actually, this is a little plug that I don't know if it's appropriate, but I did it. It's a Japanese framework called Ikigai, and it's Ikigai. But it's the framework. It's if you Google it, you'll find that there's a Medium article that kind of walks you through it. But it's basically about the intersection of what you're good at, what you can get paid for, what does the world need, what are your skills, and it's a really empowering thing, because I think especially for executive assistants, and especially no matter where you are in your career, there's a lot of translatable skills that we have, and I think, again, you're like, oh, well, I could do this, or maybe I should be doing this other thing that, is more in line with some of the things my peers have done. And I think I don't know, I just think it's a helpful kind of finding your purpose and finding things you like and are good at and just naturally do. And I think a lot of successful EAs do naturally think and kind of work this way. And that's not to say that if you grew up and you were terrible at scheduling or calendar things and now you're great at them, but that's not to say anything there. But anyway, that's a little plug, take it or leave it. But I think we got to be at work so like a minimum 40 hours a week. And I know everybody's doing more than that. And it's like, that's so much of your life to do something that like isn't a little bit empowering or a little bit, I wouldn't say fun, because sometimes work isn't fun. I appreciate, but that like is just like you're naturally good at. You're inclined to think this way. Like it isn't you're not going against the grain with every single action you take.
Totally. There's got to be alignment, And I think back to, I don't know why this example is coming to my head right now, but I went to UC Berkeley. I graduated with a degree in economics and rhetoric, right? So two degrees. One was economics.
What?
Don't ask me why I studied economics. Yeah, it makes well. I'll tell you why I studied economics. I studied economics because I thought it was the responsible thing to do. I thought it was would open doors for me. I thought it was sensible. I thought it was practical. And it never had any real alignment to how I thought, what came intuitively to me. I struggle. I mean, I was in every single office hours. Like, I don't even know how I graduated, honestly. Like, I was fighting an uphill battle with myself. And it was like, okay, well, this is what I think I should be doing versus what am I intrinsically good at? And I think about, like, you know, and I remember graduating and I went on this, it was literally the most ridiculous interview I've ever had in my life. I applied to be an analyst, which, if anyone knows me, knows that I would be like on the floor in like I would be escorted out on my first day. Like, that is not a career for me. And it was a humiliating experience going through the interview process because I didn't know anything. I didn't know how to answer anything. I felt ridiculous. I felt like an imposter. And all this because I didn't know how to just kind of acknowledge what I was good at versus what I wasn't good at. And I was trying to answer to, you know, all of these other standards that just really didn't apply to me. And so I think that, like, the earlier in your life you can figure that one out, the better off you are. Like, it's just, you know, you don't want to be a fish out of water in your own life.
It's preach, sister. It's so funny because I think to what you just said, I mean, you were 16, 17 deciding, yeah, I'll study economics. Like, you don't know anything. You don't know what you want to be. And like, I really, you know, that's a whole thing. And frankly, I'm 30 something and just figuring this out. So I really, you know, and I think I did not to, you know, gender stereotype, but I do think it is harder for women to sort that. And I think there is, and even more so, especially, you know, again, shout out to my male EAs out there, but I think as the kind of earlier career, you know, assessment that you're like, oh, I'm just an assistant, like, and it's so much more than that. And I think, like, having that confidence, and I think you get that as you get more exposure to other assistants who are like killing it and doing cool stuff. And again, the longer you're doing the thing, the more exposure you get to all these things. But I think having these reference points of like badass assistants that, you know, are like running the show, and you're like, oh, whoa, that's a big job. That's a big deal. I mean, that was me, you know, years ago. And the idea that, you know, I've managed to kind of inch towards that is like, I could pitch myself, you know, you just, it's anyway. So,
yeah. Awesome. So having confidence in oneself and one's abilities, we've determined that's pretty key, but I'm curious, you know, how does that serve you when you're in the room? And I know you've been in this room with literally the highest echelon of business leadership and executives operating in our business climate economy today, period, right? Like, we're talking the people that you read about daily everywhere, whose names are just ubiquitous and synonymous with, you know, with heavy hitting decision making in the business world. So how do you need to show up in a room like that? And, you know, I'm curious about how your confidence in yourself and your acceptance of yourself has really played into your ability to hold your own in those types of situations. And, you know, if there's some specific examples that come to mind of, you know, maybe feeling intimidated or, you know, resolving that and feeling really confident and comfortable in those situations, I'd love if you could maybe share some color around that.
For sure. This is a big one, I think, and this was fun, you know, reflecting on this. I think I kind of have two different buckets that I'd put my approach to this in. I think number one, and this is kind of like a life approach, but like everybody, this, especially one-on-one, and it's different in group settings, which I'll touch on in a second, but I think like everybody is someone's dad, mom, brother, friend, you know, son, daughter, like, and I think everybody's just a human. And I think what I've found, especially for these execs and especially for larger companies, and I think that varies, but, you know, they're treated by most of the folks at the company as like this kind of like weird celebrity. And I think while that's certainly flattering at some degree, I think having someone who just treats them like a regular human, you know, is actually refreshing. And I think also we're both adult humans. Sure, you may be a few years older than me, whatever that is, but like I think there's a real appreciation that execs have when you just kind of talk to them straight. I remember when I met Danny Meyer for the first time, when I was working at Shake Shack, and of course it's Danny Meyer. Like I studied hospitality in school. Like Danny Meyer is a big deal, and I remember meeting him, and he is a lovely man, and I was just like, oh, this guy's just like a Midwestern dad. And he was just such a sweet, kind guy. And, like, and sorry, Danny, he's younger than my dad, but he's in the range. But, I think that was certainly one of the bigger realizations I had, that like, he's just a guy, and like when you start to act all awkward and whatever, and like, oh, celebrity sighting, like that then leads them to have a less genuine interaction. And so that's definitely an approach of mine. And I can tell you, 15 more examples when I've met, quote unquote, like impressive people. And I don't mean to discount that, but I think like that kind of disarms people, especially people, like Jack Dorsey, who of course is like a big deal, but like he's just a dude. And, and I think he appreciated, as well as some other execs, like just like being treated like a dude. So that's kind of one point, that I think just like everybody's a human, and they go home to their husbands and wives and families, and they're just treated like a regular person. And so reminding yourself that like we're all humans just trying to get through the day. So that's kind of the one-on-one interactions and the approach I take on that. Quite differently, but also important, is in the group setting. I mean, for my entire career, and probably for the next period of time, I am forever the youngest person in the room. I am certainly the most junior person in the room. And I think there's an important piece where you do need to know your place in a kind of an executive team meeting, and certainly in a board meeting setting. There are certain rooms or meetings or conversations that you are welcome, and your opinion or input is appropriate and asked for. I think in executive team meetings, that is not the time typically. And again, I don't mean to speak broadly, but I think that, knowing your role in a meeting such as that is like, I'm here to listen. Mm-hmm. I'm here to take notes, probably take action items, keep the conversation moving, making sure we're on time. Like it is a very tactical role you're playing. And so I think, a couple other pieces. One is that, especially in the age of Zoom, like, your face, like you want to be as professional, as composed, stoic almost. You're going to hear some stuff that is surprising, that is bad news, that is, super confidential, and like acting as if that doesn't faze you, because even if it does, like that is showing that like you are a professional. You're not going to, you know how to keep confidentiality, kind of all that sort of stuff. And so I think that it's two kind of very different approaches, but like knowing your role. And my role is like, I'm here to keep the conversation moving, and I'm happy to do that. And half this stuff is going over my head because they're talking about engineering, yada, yada, and that's not my realm.
I definitely agree with your first bit of advice, which is humanize the executive. And I think that it might sound obvious, and yet I don't think it is. I think that being able to do that effectively is really essential to, as you said, how genuine that interaction is. And that's not a small feat, and people kind of have built these people up to these just epic proportions, like these godlike figures. Yeah. I mean, it's like, geez, Louise, how do you unpack that? But I know from having met so many executive assistants over the years who've supported really, 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 high profile individuals. I think that the source of their success is exactly that. It's the fact that they can be, they can travel with them, they can hang, they can, be in a hotel room, cranking, working on talking points until late in the night, and can be in the same space. They can coexist, that there's not this pretense. So I think That's a really, really important thing. And in fact, we have, shameless plug here, but we have our second e-course. We talk about, what is the source and the how do you really form an effective and strategic partnership? And one of the very first things we talk about is exactly that, which is that get to know your executive, and in a really honest way, And that means, humanizing them, understanding their vulnerabilities, not being intimidated, right? And I think that not being intimidated goes hand in hand with humanizing them, because when you realize that we all are subject to our frustrations, our insecurities, our vulnerabilities. I mean, you don't think somebody that's running a multi-billion-dollar organization that has the pressure of the entire world on their shoulders doesn't have vulnerable, insecure moments? Like, of course they do,
Absolutely. Like, it's so, and I think I'm excited to see that course, because I think, like, how do you do that from the jump? I think it's difficult, and some execs are super closed, and that's okay too. Like, that doesn't mean you can't slowly get to know them, or like, so, and I think part of it is also your interaction with them and others witnessing you have this like comfortable, casual interaction. Both makes your exec appear more approachable, and is really typically most execs want to appear that way, though I'm sure there are some that don't. And it also just allows others to feel more comfortable. And I think that's kind of been my experience of execs don't want people to be intimidated and awkward, like they're getting their lunch and people are, staring at them, not trying to interact, those sorts of things, which I'm sure we've all witnessed. So I think that is a big piece to kind of all success.
So how did you equip yourself at such an early, age, right? And an early point in your career to be the person in the room? How did you know how to behave? How did you know how to show up, when to speak, when not to speak, when to interject? I mean, you effectively went from college graduate to supporting a founder. I mean, like where was the middle ground for you? Like, there really wasn't, right? Like, it was a pretty meteoric step. And so I'd really love to understand. And obviously, I mean, clearly a lot of this has to do with your own EQ, your own intellect, your own ability to really read the cues and interpret things, right? And be able to abstract, right? And kind of figure things out. But to the extent that you can kind of crystallize that for people, how did you equip yourself and become so effective so quickly with so little experience under your belt at that point?
I think, first of all, I think part of it is trial and error. I'm certain I misstepped, and I was 21 years old, like, working with this founder. He had never really had a role like this before, so I think we both were kind of like learning as we went. And I think there was a bit of, he found it endearing that I was so new and green, and so was a lot more patient with me and answered my questions and that sort of stuff. Mm-hmm. I think to some degree, it is just a natural, I think, I studied hospitality in college, and I say that I did that. I mean, I do love all, food and beverage and all those sorts of things, but I did that because I love people. And that was what drew me to study hospitality. And so I think that initially it was just, I know how to read people, and establishing relationships. It was a small company, and I think that's another way I really got things done, was like, I had relationships with most of the team. And so if my boss asked me to do something that I had absolutely no idea what to do, I had 5 people I could go and be like, how do I do this? What do I do? And that still remains the case today. I, throughout all of my roles, having people, relationships, often with your execs directs and also just other key team members, like, that's how you get things done. And that's how, especially when you're early on, joining a company and getting your footing, like, you got to have somebody who's not your boss to, like, go ask questions you're either too embarrassed to ask your boss, or your boss thinks and so I think it was a lot of that. I relied on my relationships to kind of help move things along. And frankly, I might have said this earlier, but so much of it's not rocket science. Being an executive assistant, is not rocket science, I think, at least at its core. And so I think I was really focused on just the core, and I had done some smaller projects and that sort of thing. But, it was just like, okay, make sure, everything's lining up. Okay, we're ticking and tying, and it was like triple checking everything. And I lived in a life of paranoia, I'm sure. But, again, once you do something X amount of time, you have more confidence in it. And I think what might be more interesting is when I got to Shake Shack, again, I was blessed to have the CEO of Shake Shack is still a mentor and friend and just a
Mm.
wonderful man. His name is Randy Garudi. But he really, he put me in the position to, he wasn't going to let me just schedule and like that be that. And so he kind of threw me in and was like, we need your help. You need to help with XYZ, like go forth. And it was kind of like, okay, I guess you think I have the skills to do this. I guess I
Mhm.
kind of do, and I'll figure it out. So I think that, and I don't want to, I don't want to underemphasize, but I also don't want to, you know, overemphasize the fact that having wonderful, bosses and execs is really meaningful, because I do know I know of plenty, folks who have not had that same experience. But I think that, even as we were talking earlier, like your fit with your exec and that dynamic is like so important to be able to like be successful, and also and not be miserable, every day, is you really, just have that
Yeah.
human alignment with this person.
Yeah. I mean, and honestly, we could do a whole other episode about how to sniff out whether that potential for that fit is there or not. Because I do think it's like there's a
That's
sixth,
huge.
right? There's a sixth sense to really being able to sense if that person is going to enhance you and be supportive of exactly the things that you're describing, or if they're going to be a little bit more limiting in terms of how they perceive
Yes.
you. And sometimes you don't know,
It's
right? And sometimes it's trial and error. But I think if you can hone in on how to ascertain that, what questions to ask, do you have any just kind of immediate thoughts that come to mind on that front?
I do. I think it's huge. And I think there's something, it's so tough nowadays because like so many things are done over Zoom. And I do think that like you must meet your exec in person, unless it's like absolutely impossible. That being in the same room with that person and really feeling that energy, at least that's how I work, but that's huge. I think another piece of advice I would say is like you have to meet other people who work with them. Um, because I've definitely been through processes, that you're only meeting the exec and the recruiter, and you're like, okay, but let's get some more information about this person. And something I always liked, I ask a lot of personal questions, which may be off-putting to some, but I ask questions like, if I know they have kids, I'm like, who are you as a dad? Who are you as a husband or a mom and a wife? Like, that's important to me. Like personal values are really important to me. And alignment of personal values with my exec is a major thing I push for. And so just really, and some execs may be like, yo, you do not need to know that. And I think that tells me like, okay, well then we probably won't get along.
Mm-hmm.
But I really like to understand like who they are outside of work, because this job is not, as everybody knows, a 9 to 5 by any means. And it does get it. There are weekends and nights and all these sorts of things that you're, thinking about your exec. And if this person isn't a good person, or and then that's a kind of subjective, but if this person isn't aligned to your personal values or is making
Mm-hmm.
decisions in their personal life that feel like kind of icky to you or whatever, then like that's a really hard thing to show up to work and be pumped to do stuff for them. So
Right.
so I would say don't be scared to ask personal questions, and frankly like you should ask personal questions of your exec, because I think that if you're just sticking to like, well, how do you like your schedule, and
Mm-hmm.
what's your preferred type of communication, sure, those are important. But if this person ends up you know never seeing their kids and whatever, and that really doesn't stick with you, then that's a tough person to support.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we recently had China Clayton on our program. She was Michelle Obama's assistant for about
Yes.
12 years. And she told a really great story about screwing up and,
Oh gosh.
making mistakes and kind of those, egg on your face moments, which I think are, especially in the beginning of your career. I mean, they're inevitable, right? And I think they're also very humanizing. And I think it's also really wonderful and liberating to know that people as accomplished as China, who can support Michelle Obama, guess what? She's not infallible, and she has made a mistake, right? And she corrected it and she rectified it. So it'd be interesting. And you mentioned, that you and your first founder were learning together, right? And that there was an element of you guys kind of learning alongside one another, and him maybe being a little bit more, showing you a little bit more clemency because he was also learning and you were learning.
Yes.
And so maybe you could talk to us a little bit about some of those egg on your face moments, or, growing moments, especially as you made that leap, right? Going from LDV to being the right hand to the CEO of Shake Shack. Like what were some of those humanizing moments that
Oh gosh.
maybe as you look back, you go, God, I wouldn't have done it that way again, knowing what I know today.
My body
would have done it differently.
Anxiety of the memory of it. Yes, I have a few that are coming to mind right now. What I will say, actually, this is like a quick tidbit because it's funny now in hindsight, but it was so not funny at the time. I was doing for my first boss, I was doing like a handful of like personal stuff and work stuff and like scanning documents. I sent my boss's entire tax return, personal tax return, to the wrong group of people. It was not okay. So stuff like that. And like, I mean, I was horrified, and he was, again, gave me so much grace. I called him immediately as soon as I realized, and I was mortified. And he was like, it is what it, there wasn't much to do at that point. And he was laughing, but I was like hysterically crying. So that, again, two things. Always slow down, always check your attachments. I'm like, that's anyway. And I think, so let me see, this happened later on, in my role at Shake Shack, but I totally botched dates. My boss was supposed to be in Japan for a Shack opening, and the plan was he was going to go there, and then he was going to fly to San Francisco for a board meeting he had, an external board meeting he had. And so like the whole team, tons of press and all these plans were made around his trip to Japan, and like everything was set up. The opening was kind of fashioned around his availability and all this stuff. And then the week before, he's leaving like Tuesday, and this is Friday night. He realized, which is even worse, that I got the dates wrong for the board meeting. And I was horrified. And again, wonderful man, like gave me more grace than I deserved. But it was like, I feel the terror that right now, because it was just like, you can't miss stuff like that. And that's just, I think those are the worst mistakes, where they're like, this is so dumb. Like, I shouldn't have missed that. That's, and basically what had happened is like, they gave us the set of dates for, whatever it was, 2019 and 2018 side by side. And I put the wrong dates basically for the board meeting for the next year, yada, yada. But it just was like, careless mistakes are almost the worst, because like everybody knows, better. And I think that's, later on, I know you're going to ask me about, piece of advice, but this is one that I still need to be reminded, and that my mentor always tells me, which is just slow down and like and especially with big trips and that sort of stuff, like just, there's always a lot on our plates, and like there's always more you can do. But I still am upset that this happened.
Yeah. No, I can hear it.
And again, my boss is like, and then I called our guy who was the head of international Shacks at the time, and like, he was wonderful. And this is back to the relationship point. Like, I have relationships with everybody, and I called him, and I was like, I messed up. Like, what do we do? And so that he was, again, Michael Karg, he came in and shifted some stuff, and Randy had it turned out to be really tough for Randy, because obviously it was just a condensed schedule, and then he had to go show up at a 2-day board meeting, and we made it work, but it wasn't great for sure. And that's the stuff that, like, first of all, you absolutely immediately own it. Like, you're like, I totally, there's no, and even if it's only like half your fault, you eat it, because like, there's nothing, the response that your exec or whoever is going to be the most pissed at is if you immediately try to say it's not your fault. Like, that's not helping any situation. So, oh gosh. And then, there was another, I don't know if you're looking for 16 different times I messed up, but I'm not more. Anyway, it just, I think it is humbling, and it's so, and I think the worst ones are like when you know better, and then you just
Yeah.
beat yourself up because you're like, ah, dang it, like this,
Right.
and you like think back to the
But
moment that you made
here's
the error.
sure. And here's the beautiful thing is that you're human, just like your executives are human. You successfully continued in your career in each of those roles where you had, a quote unquote blunder, right? Randy is still, as you said earlier, still a friend and mentor today.
Yes, yes.
So it's all, and you still, went on to support the CEO of Twitter. So, hey, touche, right? But my point is like, it's the recovery. It's how you recover from the mistake. And what's really clear in listening to you and listening to China as well, very similar, was the ownership. Own it, own it, own it, own it, own it. Own it immediately. Don't make excuses for yourself. Demonstrate that you understand the gravity of the situation, the consequence, like own it. And I think that that's a really important thing. And not everybody is capable of that. And I think that the ones who own it are the ones who recover and go on and have relatively minor hiccups in
Totally.
the relationship, right? But if you don't, you're destined for doom.
Well, and I think that like that's execs often I think are like, okay, stuff happens, like fix it, figure out a way to fix it, unless you're like working for like Devil Wears Prada type stuff, which like even still they're like, I don't care what you do, just fix it. And I think that's it's just, we are all human, and luckily, unless someone who's listening is like working in like the emergency room, or something, we're not like saving lives. And yes, it can be a total disruption and like not great, but most of these like errors are fixable in some way, and in a couple days or a week will be like long forgotten about because there will be other fires. But that certainly, it's funny how much like internal dread I'm having remembering that specific.
But that I'm certain there are more. The fact that your skin is crawling right now also says how much you care and how much pride you take. And you wouldn't be as ashamed and embarrassed if you didn't put so much on your performance and take your role as seriously as you do. And that's also indicative of why you've had this kind of ascent and the kind of career that you've had, is because this is you are putting your name on this, and it's evident that you take that seriously.
Very much so, yeah.
So changing gears a little bit here, I'm curious about kind of the backstory of how you took your position at Twitter from EA to CMO to strategy and operations manager. Like how did that transition happen, and how did you kind of, I guess, how did that transition happen, and to what extent did you position yourself for that, or was that, how did it come about?
So I supported Leslie, our CMO, for about 2 years in an EA capacity before that transition happened. And, pretty quickly, I always say it takes, 6 months to 12 months, really 12 months to really get into a groove with your exec and where things are kind of flowing seamlessly. And so, after kind of, let's call it that 12-month mark, I was really jumping into other projects for her, taking meetings on her behalf, kind of back channeling, getting things done. Twitter was always a little chaotic. So, hands in many places running around, kind of just making sure always connecting dots. And so I was fortunate enough to, be really involved in kind of all the items that our CMO was working on. And again, I have been blessed with really wonderful execs, and we had kind of continuous over my, those 2 years conversations about, my personal growth, my career growth. She knew that marketing wasn't necessarily like my passion, and I was learning for sure and grateful for that. But my ultimate goal was to support a CEO. And so, I think it must've been at a review time that we kind of had a conversation, and she said, "Hey, let's talk about this. Like, how do we get you to level up?" And ultimately said, "Let's bring on a junior EA to take on kind of the more administrative, the calendar expenses, travel, and let's push you into kind of this more strategic strategic role, running more of the projects, still kind of train conducting all of her stuff, as well as kind of overseeing the more junior admin.
Mm-hmm.
And so it really was like she was pushing me to do it, because I am someone who like loves to be comfortable, and would have stayed supporting her for years, truly. And so I definitely hemmed and hawed about it until finally she was like, we're doing this. You're not, like you gotta, and again, this is not everybody has wonderful execs who push them and, and advocate for them and all that. And so I feel very lucky. And so she kind of kicked me out of the role and said, we're doing this. And we brought in, we had someone on the Twitter admin team who stepped in, to support her kind of in more of the basic calendar expenses, travel. And I stepped into this strategy and ops, which I'm sure, many companies have some similar type role, to just kind of be this Swiss Army knife for her, just kind of across all of her domains, and just kind of help out it more deeply in projects and kind of own things more. So again, I feel very blessed that I was in a position, and supported by my exec that, she pushed for that growth. And I learned a ton, budgeting, year-end plan, or, next year planning. I got to do some HR stuff. I got to, jump in and help out with the comms team. Like there was just like a lot of experiences I wouldn't have gotten if I was still running kind of Leslie's day to day, which was very time consuming. And I think the irony of that was when I, soon after I was officially kicked out of the EA role, I realized how much I love the calendar piece of it, and how I believe like everything is of the execs prioritization and how they spend their time, and their headspace is all managed by how the calendar is run. And so I was glad to be getting all these new experiences, but I knew that the job that I took after this one was going to be back in the EA realm, because because back to our, our first point, I love that stuff and I'm good at it. And there's a control about it that I really like too. And so the real short answer on this. Oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I think that statement is all the more powerful, Taylor, because you've tried other things, right? So saying, I love being an EA, and oh, by the way, I've had the opportunity to do different things, and this is what I want to do. I think that makes it that much more compelling, because it's not just sort of where you've fallen into, but it's you're there by choice.
Totally. And thank you for saying it that way, because that's way more nicely painted than I probably would have outlined to myself. I think that's a big piece of it for sure is I think a lot of admins want to do this kind of like the idea of like, oh, I'm going to go become chief of staff. I think that's like a typical like, stepping point that many admins, want to aspire to. And I think that it seems shinier than it is. I think, project-based stuff and all that is good. And you can do that as an admin. And, we've talked about the idea, if you picture like a Venn diagram, on one side it's admin work, and on the other side it's like chief of staff work, and in the middle is this kind of like EA plus.
A whole lot of crossover. Yep.
And I think that's the place I like to live. And I think actually a lot of admins who think they want to do kind of these bigger, meatier, you want to be a chief of staff one day, may actually find that they're really just looking for kind of EA plus stuff, and there's so much impact to be had there. And you get to do the stuff that you're good at and like and all that.
I totally understand your point. And I think there is a lot of overlap there. And in fact, that very Venn diagram is one that we put in our course, because there's kind of there's a lot of common ground between those spheres. So anyway, okay, I'm going to come back to the thing that I said I was going to come back to earlier on, which is I'd love to hear, to what extent do you think your Ivy League degree has opened doors for you as an executive assistant, or helped support this career growth that we've been talking about? And I really want to explore this, particularly for those EAs who don't have an Ivy League degree, or, maybe Maybe they do, maybe they don't, maybe they don't have a college degree at all, right? I mean, I think that what's interesting about the EA career is that there are a lot of different educational and life backgrounds that
Absolutely.
can lead to a very successful career in this space.
Yes.
So I think it would be really interesting, as somebody like yourself who has that Ivy League degree, I'd love to understand, how do you think that's weighed into how people perceive you, and if that gives you any immediate credibility when you walk into this room of these people that we've talked about, right? Does that give you an advantage at all? Has that given you an advantage in your career?
Totally. I think it's funny. I think if I had to answer this in one question, I think the answer is no. I think maybe earlier on, my first job out of school, I don't even think Parag knows where I went to college. Like I actually don't. I think, again, I'm in my 30s. Like I think it becomes less and less important as you get older. I think part of it is, so much of it is more that like your network. And so like I have had, my network from college has opened doors for me and made connections with me that that have put me in positions to get roles. For example, Randy, the CEO of Shake Shack, also went to the Cornell Hotel School that I went to, and so like there was some dot connecting there. But I don't necessarily. But frankly, again, that was my like second job out of college. So I think later in life, nobody really cares. At least that's my experience. Like right now, the most impressive thing on my resume is that I supported the CEO at Twitter, and so that's job based. And frankly, that role, I was able to get because like I had already been working there, and it was the perception of me from the work I did while I was at Twitter and while I was with Leslie. Yeah, I don't even think Parag's ever seen my resume. Like he has no idea what I did before I supported Leslie. And so I think, again, it seems way shinier, and I think especially for younger admins and younger people right out of college, like that feels so important. But my honest answer is like, even when I'm looking at resumes, for considering other roles, like I think it can mean something if you want it to mean something, but it really like it's so much more about how you show up in your interview. It's so much more about like we had this program at Twitter that was started in the last couple of years called like a generalist program, and it was basically we found folks who had no prior admin experience, and it was basically folks who were in, a lot of them in hospitality, because that's a very relevant, and dealing with people and coordinating schedules and that sort of thing. And saying like, let me teach you the basics. Like it's not rocket science to do this job. And it's, so I did not need to go to Cornell to learn how to do what I'm doing today. And frankly, like I honestly think I don't remember half the things. Actually, you talked about your econ class earlier. Econ was my hardest class. So, and I hope that feels good for people to hear, because like, it just is so much more about how you show up and like the actual work that you do than like what your resume reads. I think the tough part is like jobs, especially now in this current like economy and stuff, like it's always helpful to like know someone who works there or know someone who knows someone. Like that is a very real thing about the current job market and how it all works. But and yes, your network is related to that. But I for me to show up, in these exec meetings with confidence, where I went to college is nowhere on my radar. It's more like I did this for so and so, and I was, it's more my past job experiences.
Right. Yeah, I think that's really helpful for people to hear, because I do think that can be an insecurity for people. I mean, I remember having a conversation very recently with a candidate who was saying, well, I never finished college because I got married and I had kids and I got on this, career path and this and that. And do you think that's going to negatively impact me in my job search? And I was like, well, yeah, if you have that attitude about it,
exactly.
It's definitely going to. So again, like the very first thing that we started talking about when we started this conversation was about owning who you are and not apologizing for who you are, what you like, what you don't like, what you're good at, what you're not good at, like whatever it is, what it is, it's who you are. And it's the spin and how much what is the word I'm looking for? How much kind of emphasis or weight you allow that to carry in
Story.
who you are. It's your story. How do you tell your story? And I can tell
100%,
you,
100%.
I know a lot of executive assistants who are, many of whom have been on this program, some of whom haven't, but many of them that are operating at the highest levels of support. And when I say highest levels, I'm talking household name brand. You say this executive's name, you know exactly who they are. People that support those types of people, a lot of whom either don't have a college degree and or have a college degree from not a university that necessarily carries a whole lot of weight. And they've been able to rise to the top of their game. There's also examples like yourself and others that I can think of who did get top-notch degrees and have also done very well for themselves. But I don't think that fact in and of itself is the predetermining factor for your success.
And no shade to I had a great college experience and all that good stuff, but like 100%, this job is so much more about everything I learned in college, I don't use. Like, let's just call it what it is. It's so much more about like everything, but it's so much more about the context you're gathering and like how good you are at connecting dots. And that is just like this job is such a human centric job. And frankly, you learn a lot more about that in real life than anything else. And one other piece I wanted to touch on, kind of to your point of like owning your narrative and owning where you're at, like in interviews and stuff. That's refreshing for you to be honest. Honesty is the only thing you got. So like trying to like wrap something in a fake package and like because you're insecure about it or whatever, that comes across very clearly in interviews. Like own it. You're here. You're like, you got the interviews. So something, you got yourself in the door. So like, you don't need to, I think having confidence, exactly what you've been saying, like having confidence in like, yeah, this is me. This has been my, story thus far. I'm still writing the rest of it. And like, here it is.
Yeah. And also, yes, to what you just said, you got yourself in the door. Like, hello, they already agreed to give you the time. So don't use your time to apologize for who you are. Like use your time to explain your value. So yeah, very well said, Taylor. We've been touching on this throughout this conversation, but just to kind of sum it up, and if there's any other tidbits that you have for our listeners, Taylor, what advice do you have for our listeners who want to shore up their confidence and they want to reach for greater heights within their own EA careers? What can you tell them? What recommendations do you have?
So I've probably covered any of the things I'm going to say, but I'll at least put them here in kind of more succinct points. I think the first thing is, as I've said, like honing the basics. No matter what level you're at, you need to be excellent at the calendar, and you need to have, and whatever that means for your exec, whatever that means for you specifically, a style you like to put it in, just consistency and like those sorts of things are very important. And again, that's at every level. And so like, as soon as that becomes like a second nature to you, that's excellent, because then when you get to the C-suite, those things don't cause you stress because you've already done it a million times. And so that's calendar, that's travel, that's expenses. Everybody hates expenses. That never gets better. But I
shout out to Expensify, maybe.
Yeah, oh God, concur. That really is. That never gets better. But I think I think a lot of admins are hungry for projects and the exciting stuff, and then kind of phone in the basics. And I think that's a very big mistake, because your exec at their core, like if their calendar is not how they want it, everything else doesn't matter. You could be killing it at projects, but if their calendar isn't tight, like that's the core of your job. And so kill the basics. That's the point number one. I think another piece, which is like a bit of a Danny Meyerism, but it's always be connecting dots. Like every conversation you have, every meeting you sit in on, you're listening out to connect dots to another conversation, to follow up with your exec, you're taking notes. It just makes you better. The more context you have of the organization, of what's going on, of the people, helps you be better at your job and helps you support your exec better. And so that's just always listening, always, it's a bit of context switching, but just always ear on the ground for something that is relevant to another conversation you listened in on. And those are the things that make you valuable when you say, oh, actually yesterday you mentioned XYZ. And anyway, you get the point there. Let's see what else. I think I mentioned this earlier, but having good relationships with your execs directs is really valuable. And that's both personal relationships, just like getting to know them. Okay, so-and-so has this, 2 kids and whatever, those sorts of personal information that are helpful to just get to know them, because one, them having trust in you is huge. And you being able to help your exec get things done because you already have that rapport. So invest the time in making relationships with them. And I appreciate that, in the Zoom, virtual world, it's definitely takes more effort, but I would schedule, especially if you're first joining in a company, like schedule time with all of the direct reports, ask them about themselves personally, ask them about what they do, ask them how you can help them, and how, the gaps they think your boss has, that sort of stuff. Like, you should be seen as a core confidant of them to get things done as well. So that's a big one that I think some people feel like, oh, that's not my place, or like, oh, they don't want to talk to me. Like, no, they do. And they know if you're good at your job, they know that like going to you gets things done faster sometimes than them going to your exec. And then I'm sorry, I'll keep going. I don't know how long you've got for this, but I think I mentioned this earlier, and slow down. I have many of my mistakes that I've made in the last years have been because I'm moving too fast, and because we always have 6 things in the air, and there's always urgency, and it's always hurry, hurry, hurry. And there are times where if you take even just like a 5-second pause to just take a breath and like understand where your priorities are, you won't make some of these stupid mistakes. Or like you send an email and you're like, oh my gosh, I said the wrong time, or oh, I hit reply all, or just these like little things. So it's a slow down. We're not saving lives. It will get done. And it's better for you to come across collected and like your thoughts are succinct and you're organized and you send 1 email rather than 3 follow-ups. That's a way better look, even if it takes 30 more minutes for you to do, than you sending 5 emails in succession, because you forgot something. That's so, and then I have one more if you'll allow me.
Yeah, we want all of it.
And I think something that I think is kind of understated is that like a very big portion of our job is communication and communications, and that's written communications, and whether that's an email or even as, again, hybrid world means that it's definitely, in some digital form or in person, and that every single interaction you have with someone directly reflects your boss. And that's a lot of weight. But you do need to be really mindful. When I had a former mentor of mine say, imagine every single email you write will end up in like on the front page of the newspaper or in your board member's inbox. And that changes the way you write things. And even if it's just, therefore you want everything to be super tight and thoughtful, and you're not sending flippant remarks, or you're not sending misspellings or those sorts of things. And so I think being mindful of how you're communicating, and because it is so important. And again, taking 5 extra minutes to write that email actually is worth it than you coming across as kind of, speedy and disorganized. Okay, I'm done, I think, now.
Yeah, no, but it's all so wise and all so on point. I have a final question for you. And it is our question that we ask of everyone, which is, if you could support anyone in the world, this could be throughout the course of history and time, who would you choose to support and why?
Okay, I have to tell you, I've been like spiraling about this question because since I read it, because it's so, and it's actually funny you brought up China earlier, because like Michelle Obama was definitely on my list of like, again, just powerhouse humans. I think again, I was going through, I was racking my brain thinking about this, because I think there's so many people that are so inspiring and so fascinating, and people like Steve Jobs, Warren Buffett, like really cool titans that I think would be, again, fascinating to support. I think where I've landed, which is not too far from Michelle, is if I could support like the pre-2008 election, Barack Obama, like in Chicago and hit the presidential campaign. I think that would be fascinating because I've always been interested in politics. It's gotten way uglier lately, which is all I'll say about that. But I think I have a general sense, and then that's by no means all encompassing, but of, what the business world, especially like the tech business world, looks like and kind of how it moves. And so I think politics would be a totally new realm, and I would be fully in over my head, but it would be really exciting. And that would be I just remember that time. Shoot, I was in high school. So that would be a fascinating thing to be able to do.
And what is it about pre-presidential Obama that excites you as opposed to presidential Obama?
So I think it would be, more interesting in the kind of lead up to the election, because it would be, it would be more of a hustle, more scrappy, and kind of this excitement. I think, when I remember the year, leading up to it, and just, it was such a momentous time when he was, going up for election and got elected, and it was so major. And I think like being part of the team that got to celebrate that would be really epic. And I'm sure also, once you get to the White House, things shift and move differently. And I think it would probably be a more authentic experience than probably some of the pre-established dynamics of how a president moves and how things get done.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that makes sense. And I think it's consistent with how you've shared what you care about throughout this whole conversation, which a lot of it is about authentic, genuine connection and, supporting him really as in his authentic self when he was campaigning versus how he has to show up as the president. Those are two different things. Right. So yeah, that feels consistent with what.
First of all, I'm so thrilled. I'm so thrilled that you've gotten all of that from these answers, because that is very true to me, and I feel you're an excellent prompter and truly the number one hype woman I've ever had. So,
Taylor, you can take me in your pocket, or fit me in your purse, or whatever, in your luggage. Yeah, well, you're very easy to hype. Trust me, it's very, very easy to get behind you and to be on your team. So. Thank you so much. I think this is such a wonderful, wonderful conversation. And I really appreciate you sharing, like, all of you, right? Because I think it's really easy for people to look at someone like yourself and be like, oh, she's probably never screwed up. She's probably never made mistakes. She's got this, she's got that. She's done this, she's done that. And the reality is that, you've had this really wonderful career, and you've also learned along the way, and you've made mistakes along the way, and you're figuring it out. And, I think that we're all figuring it out. Exactly. And I think if anything, this hopefully gives some people a little bit of a boost in that sense, where they're not, it's really starts with owning yourself, owning who you are, being real with yourself. And, also forgiving yourself, giving yourself the space to screw up, learning how to recover from that. Like, there's a lot of great things that we've talked about thematically today that I think are really, really valuable sound bites for people.
And just like life too. Yeah. I'm grateful you took us in that direction too, because I just think we're only here for, 100 years if we're lucky. We got to work for, 60 of them. And it's just like, if you have to do something, how you spend your days is how you spend your life. That's kind of a quote I think about. And it's like, work is a thing we have to do, unless you're incredibly lucky, and then good for you. But, make it something that is aligned with like what you like to do and what works for you. And it just, that's not every day. Everybody has bad days, and I certainly have my slew of them too. So, we're all figuring it out. And I think that's something I also realized is like, sure, I again feel so blessed. And I was, when I was supporting Parag specifically at Twitter, I was in over my head. I was like, what am I doing? Do I know how to do this? And you figure it out. And like, everybody's just figuring it out. So
exactly. And those are the growing moments. I mean, if all you're ever doing is what you already know how to do, you're not growing.
Right, and you're not stretching.
Yeah.
Yes.
No,
Yes.
not at all.
Yes,
Not at all.
exactly.
And I think that's another great takeaway is like, it's okay to be outside of your comfort zone, even this far into your career or whatever. That's actually a good thing, right? I mean, that's exactly where you want to be. Yeah.
Otherwise, you're not growing. You're stagnant.
Right.
And I think like if you're not a little scared or a little over your skis, then like you probably could have stretched farther. That's how you grow. But anyway, I could stay chatting with you all day.
I know. Me too. Let me tell you, it's very, very easy. You're intoxicating in that way. So anyway, well, I have so enjoyed this conversation. Thank you for being a part of this conversation.
Thank you for having me. This was so wonderful. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Reach is brought to you by Maven Recruiting Group, who specializes in placing executive assistants and support staff to the Bay Area's most prominent executives and companies. If you've enjoyed being part of our podcast community and are interested in becoming part of our candidate community, we're currently hiring for roles in San Francisco, Silicon Valley, and Los Angeles. You can visit us at www.mavenrec.com to see some of the roles we're currently working on and to submit your resume.